Hello, it's Tom here. Before we get into another brilliant episode of Last Orders, this one with the great Francis Foster, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been leaving us ratings and reviews on your podcast app. It's a really great way to support the show now that we've gone bi-weekly. So if you do like the show and you haven't left a review yet, do hop on your podcast app and leave us a glowing 5-star rating and review. Thank you as well to the people who've been sending in your postbag questions. It's been a great addition to the show. We really enjoy answering them. So if you want your chance to have your question answered in our next episode, just email them in to lastorders@spiked-online.com. That's lastorders@spiked-online.com. You can, of course, also get at us on social media. So thanks so much. And now back to the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast all about freedom and the nanny state. In this episode, we discuss the scourge of passive cake, the ridiculousness of Seatbeltgate, and the legacy of St. Jacinda. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the IEA. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm not too bad, Tom. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you. Not too bad. We're delighted to be joined by a very special guest on today's episode, Francis Foster, co-host of the Trigonometry podcast and a brilliant stand-up comedian. Francis, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Really happy to be here, Tom.
So we're going to kick off by talking about the big ridiculous nanny state story of the month. I think it's fair to say that was the story of secondhand cake. Mm-hmm. So we found out from Professor Susan Jebb, who's the chair of the Food Standards Agency. She was speaking at some Times Health Summit where she came out with this analogy that bringing cake into the office is essentially as harmful as secondhand smoke. She's walked it back a little bit, but that's essentially what she was saying. She also held forth on junk food advertising and how that impacts on people getting fat and so on and so forth. But this was really the one that made headlines. Chris, do you want to talk us through this kind of latest threat to people's well-being that's been pointed out here?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, what he was trying to say was quite banal, and it got blown up a bit out of context by the Times, that they then put it on the front page with the headline.
Their own event as well.
Yeah, their own event. Yeah, they obviously want to promote their own event. They've got some awful committee of people like Henry Dimbleby and the chairman of Tesco, who always seems to get involved in these things, and this Susan Jebb, some kind of health committee she's going to advise on. The kind of nanny state regulation the Times loves these days. And Susan Jebb I've known about for donkey's years because she's a kind of public health quango queen, really. She's gone through various government jobs, but she's always pushing for nanny state legislation, banning advertising and stuff like that. And so she'd said that, yeah, like you say, the bringing a cake into the office is as dangerous as passive smoking, which I actually agree with, but probably not for the reasons that Susan Jebb was thinking. If she'd have just said, if you work in an office and there are people around you trying to watch their weight, maybe it's not a good idea to bring cakes and chocolate in every day and shove them under their faces. I don't think it would have been a big story, right? I mean, it's a fairly reasonable thing to say. It's none of the Food Standards Agency's business, but it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But she didn't do that. She brought in the aspects of passive smoking, and I don't think that was an accident. I think she deliberately raised the spectre of passive smoking because passive smoking is banned in the office, right? She's well aware of the implications of talking about passive smoking. It's banned everywhere, effectively, and it was banned everywhere because a lot of nanny statists wanted to stop people smoking in practice, right? And those same people want to stop people eating cake. And although she obviously didn't propose a ban on bringing cake into the office or a ban on cake or anything like that, it was the use of that terminology which I found very telling, because it implies, firstly, that the government should do something about it somewhere down the road, but it also implies that obesity, which you now have to refer to as living with obesity for some politically correct reason, but obesity, people who live with obesity, it's not the consequence of their choices. It's something that's inflicted on people like passive smoking. It's something that they're subjected to, something they have no choice over, because it's all about the food environment. And part of the food environment is people bringing in cakes. So I just thought it was an interesting, and obviously a lot of people did because it was on the front page of the Times and it generated a lot of conversation. It was very interesting and telling terminology.
And Francis, what did you make of all this? Is passive cake a big problem in the trigonometry studios, or is this something you recognise?
Passive cake. It kind of reminds me of, do you remember Brass Eye, that drug cake that he said?
Yeah.
That brilliant sketch by Chris Morris. So I don't understand why it's anyone's business what people do in an office, provided that you work. Surely the whole point of an office is that you go there, you do mundane work that slowly drains your soul, you hate every single second of it, and then, in a way to compensate for it, you eat your feelings. That's the entire point of it, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
And you're going to eat your feelings by eating processed refined sugar, which is absolutely dreadful, and it's going to put you out of your misery 15 years earlier than normal, which is what everyone wants. So I don't see the point. To me, and look, I think society has gone downhill ever since we banned smoking on airplanes. That's when our society hit its peak. Think about it, right? You're in an airplane, you are hundreds of feet in the air, on top of a literal tank of air fuel, and you were smoking a cigarette. That was it. That was the peak.
They were good days.
Now, we've banned smoking on planes, we've banned smoking, we're going to ban cake, and it's going to be like the only time you're going to be able to eat anything is sugar-free granola at the office.
This is definitely the right podcast for you, Francis. I'm glad we got you. But yes, we used to be a real country. We used to be a real civilization. It's striking how quickly a lot of these changes are taking place. And Chris, in the comments made at this summit, it was interesting how you see this kind of line being trotted out, which is basically like choice is kind of bullshit, which seems to be the kind of source of everything that they're saying, that because of the fact that you might be in a certain environment and not all choices are there, or some bad choices might be there that shouldn't otherwise be. Your high street might be full of chicken shops rather than Whole Foods. So it's kind of like an observation that an 8-year-old could make, but is then extrapolated out to, therefore, free will is basically nonsense. Is that kind of at the root of all of this, is that they just don't really believe that people are capable and smart enough to make choices for themselves?
That's basically what she was saying. Yeah, I mean, that's very well put, that that people don't truly have choice. And they would only have real free will and real choice if people like Susan Jebb were regulating the food environment. And although she didn't mention anything about regulating cake, she did specifically then go on to talk about so-called junk food advertising, which the government is planning on banning and keeps pushing back because it's actually quite difficult to define what junk food is and various other reasons. But she was pushing for that, and she's pushed for all sorts of other stuff, the sugar tax, I think once taxes on actual, physical sugar and salt, and so on. And in that way, supposedly, we become more free. It's kind of, like you say, it's kind of banal to say that we are influenced by the environment. And in some cosmic sense, perhaps we don't have total free will because we are limited to some extent by the environment around us. Now, as it happens, our food environment is more diverse and more affordable than ever before. So I don't think it's a particularly compelling explanation for the rise in obesity in recent decades. But in the case of offices, you see, you can't even blame the food industry. Normally it's the food industry are putting the chocolate by the checkout and they're advertising this stuff on TV. But of course, in the case of offices, if people wanted to bring in carrot sticks, then they could do, but they don't do that because it's not a treat, because people don't like carrot sticks. So they bring in cakes because people like them. So it rather actually reveals that the food environment is actually very much a market-driven phenomenon, and that people actually really do like cakes, and that is why people bring them in. That is why they are advertised, insofar as they are advertised, and the reason people buy them. But in that cosmic sense, people are never free because the environment is always there, right? This is kind of the point they're making, the authors of Nudge make, which is that the choice architecture, as they call it, is a thing, regardless of whether the government uses nudge or coercion or whatever. So in that sense, which I don't really buy into, you're never fully free, but nor would you be free under Susan Jebb's version. It would just be a different food environment that's regulated by the government. And in a very literal way, people, or at least food companies, would be less free because they're not able, in the case of advertising, to communicate with their customers.
And as you say, kind of regulated by the most miserable people imaginable. I don't know what you think about this, Francis, but these people don't even seem to recognise just what a miserable life they're trying to foist on everyone else. So we've got the kind of passive cake example. Dame Sally Davies, who was Chris Whitty's predecessor as the chief medical officer, made headlines a few years ago because she said that every time she drinks a glass of wine, she thought about cancer and she encouraged other people to do the same. Where do they find these people? You know, what is it about that kind of mindset that people feel that they want to foist a pretty miserable existence on everyone else?
Do you know what opened my eyes to this the most was the pandemic. The glee, the joy that certain people took in telling other people how to live their lives. It was almost like it was some kind of base sexual thrill for them. I remember I went to Borough Market in between one of the lockdowns, right? And if people overseas listeners, Borough Market is one of the biggest open air food markets in London, right? For fatties, like I used to be, it is a nirvana, right? So you go there and the whole purpose of it is you wander around and you shovel things in your face for 3 times the price of what they should normally cost. That's the purpose of it, right? So we went there and we were walking around and we bumped into somebody a mutual friend, myself and Constantine, a mutual friend of ours who we hadn't seen in months because it was a pandemic. And we saw him, we were like, oh, hey, how are you doing? This is in an open air food market. Out of nowhere, this kind of little weasel popped up with a high-vis jacket and aviator glasses. And he said the words, no talking, keep moving.
Bloody hell.
On an open air market. And we were just like, why? And he was just like, it's COVID regulations. And it didn't matter about COVID. You could tell that he was almost semi-aroused under his trousers. Because he got the chance for once in his miserable little existence to tell people what to do. And this is what these people are. How miserable do you have to be that every time you drink wine, you think about cancer?
It's dreadful.
They are, yeah. I mean, these people are psychologically interesting. They are, I'm pretty sure, a minority. But I mean, it's them who should be kind of studied and almost feel sorry for. I mean, and I don't want to get ad hominem about this, but have you actually seen these people? I mean, both the people we mentioned there, old Dame Sally and Susan Jebb, they don't scream joie de vivre to me. Do you mean? They're both quite skinny, but not in a very healthy looking way. They're not anything, I don't think, that most people would kind of aspire to, and you don't really envy their lives. You don't envy thinking like that the whole time. And yet these are the people in charge, effectively, you know. And that's the other thing about this Susan Jebb episode is, as I say, it's none of the Food Standards Agency's business, obviously, whether people bring cake into the office. If the cake is poisoned, fair enough, maybe the Food Standards Agency should be getting involved. But why? I mean, and to be fair, they did release a statement saying we don't agree with Susan Jebb on this, or it's not the official policy of the Food Standards Agency to ban cake in the office. There must have been some people in the office probably getting quite worried, I imagine, at the FSA. There's going to be a voluntary cake ban in the office to test it out. Like with Jamie Oliver bringing his voluntary sugar tax in his restaurants. That went well. Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, what's he got to do with the FSA? Why is it? It's not the first time the FSA has got involved with this. I remember a few years ago, before a World Cup, they started nagging people about don't drink too many pints of lager and don't eat too many crisps. It's why are they getting involved with this? Why is someone like Susan Jebb, who is, I'm not quite sure professionally what she is. She's some sort of food scientist, nutritionist type person, I think. But she's basically in nanny status. The whole thing has been, you know, let's regulate the food environment. Why is she in charge of the FSA? It was set up specifically to investigate restaurant poisonings with quite a small team of staff, because we already have people who kind of make sure restaurants are safe. It now has a budget of about £150 million and is nagging people about cake and pints of lager. It's just a very good example of the mission creep that you get with these Blairite quangos. And after 13 years of Tory government, not only have the Tories not reformed them or abolished them or slimmed them down, they're still appointing people like Susan Jebb to run them.
Mission creep and also people going native seems to be the story whenever it comes to public health. Even if you get a semi-sensible person in, they just go nuts after about 6 weeks. But Francis, you brought up there how COVID has ruined everything or brought out the worst in people. It certainly brought the worst out in the media. And I kind of feel like we're still living with the after effects of that in terms of a story that happened last week, which I wouldn't mind touching on. So it's another kind of Tory scandal. It's fair to say it's been eclipsed this week by Nadeem Zahawi and his somewhat convoluted tax affairs. But nevertheless, I thought it was quite funny and quite revealing. This was Seatbeltgate. So this was Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. He was nipping around Lancashire doing some announcements to do with levelling up. He did one of those little social media videos that he likes to do where he kind of addresses the nation in the manner of like a CBBC presenter. They're a bit sort of creepy. But he did this one in the back of a moving taxi. Eagle-eyed tweeters and journalists noticed that he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. It was written up. It was in the news websites. The police got involved. They investigated, fined him. So he's now had to apologise, say he'll pay the fine and so on. A classic kind of mad response as well that you'd expect from the Labour Party. Chris Bryant called for an election for the 8th time that day. Nick Thomas-Simmons said, it said a great deal about the depths to which the Conservative Party has sunk.
Yeah, it's a real low point for
The thing is, these kind of, what do you say after that when the next scandal rolls around? But it was very funny, but it was also, I think, quite revealing about how after Partygate, we're still kind of hooked on this very kind of pearl-clutching, moralistic, scandal-mongering kind of mode amongst the media. What did you make of all this, Francis?
I thought, obviously, it was a story about nothing. No one really cares. If you talk to the average bloke on the street and a woman and you went up to them, I realise those words are problematic now, and I probably should include a number of other people as a result, and you said to them, what do you think about Rishi Sunak not wearing a seatbelt? I think there would be just a general look of bemusement as to why this is important. If you think about, like, take Michelle Mone or whatever her name is, the alleged corruption that went on during COVID with the contracts, with the PPE. Why aren't we talking about that? Instead, we're talking about the fact that Rishi Sunak, right, the squeakiest out of all the squeaky clean politicians, a man who looks so dull, he doesn't even look like he's ever had a Marlboro Light, didn't wear a seatbelt in a taxi. You just think that people are going mad. They're going absolutely mad. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm no fan of Rishi Sunak. I think some of his policies, like, for instance, I used to be in education, I used to be a teacher, this idea that somehow people should be kept at school until the age of 18, kids, and then learn maths. To me, that's a form of torture. And that's what happens when you get nerds in power, right? They've never had power before. This is what this all comes down to. You have these glorified virgins who get into power, and suddenly they feel that they can tell everybody what to think, what to do. And you get it on both sides. Do you remember student politicians at university? That is the definition of a virgin. And all of a sudden they've got power, which is what they've always wanted, because no one would sleep with them. And here we are.
I love that. We live under the tyranny of virgins.
Yeah.
It all comes back to sex for you, doesn't it, Francis?
Yeah, it does. Like Freud, mate.
Well, what do you make of Seatbeltgate, Chris? I mean, you're at the IA, so presumably you think he hasn't done anything wrong legally either, or shouldn't have, but,
Yeah, I mean, people shouldn't be forced to wear seatbelts, and he had the power to change the law if he wanted to, and he didn't do it. So, I mean, that's the only consistent way of looking at this, is I don't care about it because I don't think people should have to wear seatbelts. But instead, it turned into yet another, like Francis says, a storm in a teacup, really, because the media, having ousted Boris Johnson and Liz Truss in pretty short order, really wants to do it again and again. It loves doing it. Political journalists are a scourge in this country because they're so focused on the trivia and personalities and Westminster gossip and intrigue and all this kind of stuff. So they blew the Partygate thing out of all proportion. I mean, I was writing about the near miss with lockdown last Christmas, for Spiked, in fact, and looking at the front pages at the time, because I was assuming they're all going to be about Omicron and are we going to lock down? And there actually wasn't very much of that because it was all about Partygate. They were so obsessed with it that even, the big issue at the time, objectively, was, are we going to go lockdown and what's going on with all these cases of Omicron? But no, it was, did he, didn't he? Now, with the Partygate thing, there was a genuine did he, didn't he aspect to it, right? Because it was very hard to interpret the law. And as far as I can see, somebody turned up in his office, I don't want to go over all ground, but someone turned up in his office with a cake and he didn't have a lot of choice other than to say, yeah, thanks for the cake, let's maybe have a slice of it. Whereas with Rishi, I mean, the law says you've got to wear a seatbelt. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. It's an open and shut case. And obviously people like Chris Bryan went over the top. But then people on the other side started going like, what about Keir Starmer? There's a video of Keir Starmer 20 years ago in the back of a taxi not wearing a seatbelt, where you're not even legally obliged to wear a seatbelt, as I recall. So it got a bit kind of pathetic. Yeah, but it's a kind of a pathetic story. But at the end of the day, obviously he should have got penalty notice for it. He's breaking the law. I suppose he should be setting an example. He could have changed the law if he wanted to. So I didn't think it was, worthy of breaking news on the BBC. But I think people's attempt to defend him were pretty obviously lame and partisan,
It's that slippery thing where it's like, it's not to say that this isn't a story, but it shouldn't be the story, and it probably shouldn't be the story for a week or whatever it is.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But the media is just, as you say, so dreadful at the moment. Like Partygate, again, like at first, that's quite shocking and embarrassing, and, showed up that kind of lockdown was just for the chumps, particularly at that point. Made people understandably angry, but then it turned into this months-long saga. I mean, Paul Brand over at ITV is still putting out a 7-part podcast series.
Yes, he is.
It was so weird. You had particularly him and Pippa Crerar and so on. They were carrying on like they were Bob Woodward, like, uncovering Watergate, when all they were doing was waiting for some bored spad to send them like a grainy photo of Boris Johnson enjoying a tiny can of Astray in the afternoon. Like, it was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. But on and on it goes. I mean, Partygate seems like it's going to come back. So we've got that to it with Privileges Committee is going to be televising its hearings. So we've got all that to...
And then presumably the COVID inquiry, which is just going to go on for years, isn't it? And
it's just going to be about that.
Awful.
As well.
Yeah, it's going to be basically...
Just going to be about Partygate. Everything else will be completely forgotten. But, before we move on to... This is actually a perfect point to move on to Jacinda Ardern, given we're talking about COVID and authoritarianism and everything else. So she shocked the world, or shocked the kind of international journalistic class who love her very deeply, last week when she announced that she was going to be resigning ahead of the next election. Why she resigned was pretty obvious. I mean, despite being very popularly re-elected back in 2020, her opinion polling has just gone through the floor. She's incredibly polarising now. There was obviously, towards the end of kind of New Zealand's COVID regime, there was a lot of protests, a lot of unrest because of the impacts of the zero COVID policy. The shine has definitely come off of her. And yet everyone just seemed to kind of credulously report her claim that it was just because, she can't give it her all. And she just chooses to resign so that it's not that she can't win, it's just that she can't give it her all. But it's all of the responses internationally. It has kind of shown up how, even though Jacinda mania, to the extent it ever existed in New Zealand, has calmed down quite significantly, it hasn't got anywhere amongst international leaders and the press more broadly. Francis, what do you make of Jacinda now that she's on the way out? What kind of legacy does she leave, do you think?
Well, I found the whole Jacinda phenomenon very interesting, because if you remember at the very start of the pandemic, she shut all the borders, which ironically all left-wing people celebrated when they normally hate that kind of thing. But she shut all the borders and she effectively isolated New Zealand, which at the time, nobody really knew what was going on. You could argue that was a good policy, right? Then what happened is people went, she has the right idea because she's a woman. And the men have all got it wrong. Do you remember that? It's women who are handling the pandemic better. I'm like, well...
Her and Merkel and so on, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thought it didn't matter what, race, gender, whatever it was. But anyway, so she handled it better because she was a woman. And then she just went absolutely tonto with her COVID rules. My favourite story to come out of New Zealand is that 2 men were arrested for smuggling KFC over city lines. They were arrested with 100,000 New Zealand dollars in cash, 3 buckets of chicken, 10 cups of coleslaw, and an undisclosed number of fries, which I think was the best amount. You can just imagine some New Zealand police officer going, yeah, we can't disclose the amount of fries. It was a lot. Street value worth millions, mate. And you're just going, this is insanity. This is absolute insanity. I did a video about it on Twitter, and I'm like, the society has lost its mind when organised crime takes over from Uber Eats. It's just nuts, and it just descended. And the entire zero COVID policy, looking back, you go, whose bright idea was that? And you go, oh, China, yeah, because they're really good when it comes to human rights and caring about their population and their citizens. They're number one on that. And then you had whatever his name was, Neil, I can't even remember now. I've blocked his name out because I never want to think. Neil Ferguson saying, China told us what we can do or showed us a way, or whatever moronic statement that dribbled out of his mouth. So I think this has actually shown is the danger of zero COVID. Lockdowns really didn't work, and all they did was just disproportionately affect the weakest and most vulnerable in society. And I think that's the reason why she left, is that she just went over her remit, if I'm being honest.
I'm going to put you down as not a fan of Jacinda, but Chris, what do you make of, how do you think she's going to be sort of remembered, as this kind of saint or as this sort of kindly authoritarian, as she kind of presented herself as almost?
Well, probably as a saint, from what I can gather. I mean, she's just, even leaving aside the COVID stuff, she's just, I find, a very, very nauseating, smug, kind of condescending, empty vessel for bad ideas. Just a dreadful.
Say what you think, Chris.
Career politics. Well, I don't really understand how anyone can see it otherwise. She just seems to me one of these people who, if you like her, we can probably never really be friends. There's certain people in this world who their popularity totally mystifies me. James Corden, Jamie Oliver, a few, Trudeau in Canada is another person. Now, obviously, some people like him, and I don't understand at all why.
It's because he's sexy.
Trudeau, yeah,
it is.
He's a master of disguise as well. Apparently, let me just read you what the BBC said about her on the Today programme. This is according to Tom Harwood. I don't listen to the Today programme, but on his Substack, he quoted some quite incredible gushing praise from journalists. So the Today programme said, her decision has shocked the nation. Jacinda Ardern's leadership style, based on kindness and compassion, has gained a wide popularity both inside New Zealand and around the world. Beth Rigby said, I've only ever seen political leaders forced out or voted out, but in Ardern we find a rare exception who again shows us how to lead differently. I mean, the BBC thing in particular is based on kindness and compassion. The word kindness has taken on a kind of sinister feel, by the way, recently. Yeah. Don't you notice? This be kind thing is very, very Orwellian, because it usually doesn't mean kindness.
Just be kind or else, usually.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people go on about BBC bias, and I try not to, except in very clear-cut cases. But I genuinely think, and have met plenty of people at the BBC who are genuinely committed to putting both sides and being neutral, right? And partly that's because it's a legal obligation for them to do so. But also, some of them are genuinely pretty apolitical, or consider themselves to be apolitical. They just want to put out a good show, and they want different voices and the rest of it. But often they just can't help themselves from being biased, because in the case, and Jacinda Ardern is a very good example of this, for certain people in a certain mindset, it is just obvious that Jacinda Ardern is a great gal. Right?
Yeah.
And that she everyone likes her, and she's done the right thing, and she means well, and she's shown us the true meaning of leadership, or whatever it is they said. And they just can't imagine there are people like us who just find her to be a nauseating and annoying creature who makes your skin crawl every time she opens her mouth. And that's the problem with the BBC and a lot of the media, is that it's not that they're deliberately being partisan. It's just that they genuinely can't imagine that there's another opinion.
And it was so strong. I mean, even with the way they were talking about her resignation, as if it was so unusual, like a politician barreling out because the polling's bad and elections coming out.
Well, didn't the previous New Zealand Prime Minister bow out?
Very similar circumstances. Because I think that he was the National Party PM, so another party, John Key. He resigned in 2016. Sort of similar profile. He was very popular for a while and then just sort of took a nosedive, not internationally recognised in quite the same way. What's funny is when he resigned, he even used the same phrase. He said, I've got nothing left in the tank. So it was to say what a unique resignation was a little bit odd.
A bit like Kevin Keegan when he resigned as England manager. What did he say? He said the job's just a bit too big for him or something like that.
Yeah. Didn't he quit in a toilet as well?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think there was something like in the toilet in Wembley, like he told everybody that he couldn't do it anymore, and then anyway.
Yeah, I think he said this job's just a bit too big for Kevin Keegan. He does like talking about himself in the third person. But anyway, we're getting a little bit off topic there. I'm sorry, Tom, what were you saying?
No, not at all. Just before we move on to the last section, Francis, what do you make of this kind of, because it does feel like this new generation of for lack of a less contradictory phrase, like liberal authoritarians, the Trudeaus.
Yeah.
The Arderns, Biden to a certain extent. These are, it's really kind of stark how kind of around the world you have these various different figures who really upfront how compassionate, how inclusive, how lovely they are and so on. And yet, if it means ushering in a two-tier society for vaccinated, unvaccinated, that compassion evaporates. If it means silencing critics and protesters, that liberalism evaporates. Like, where has this come from, do you think?
Look, basically, it's like what your mum or our mums told all of us. If someone tells you that there's something, don't believe them. It's like if you go and buy a second-hand car from Honest Dave's Car Emporium, chances are Dave ain't going to be honest. And if anybody just bangs on about how woke and how liberal and how kind they are, there's always a part of me that goes, yeah, I bet he's fucked a kid. You know? Why try so hard? Why are you trying so hard? Why are you trying to persuade me? What have you got to hide? Look at Trudeau. He's all like, yeah, I'm just such a great guy. You know, one of the funniest things about the whole vaccine mandate discussion, because like my dad is into he's like old. He's an old English person, which means he bloody loves the Second World War and he reads about it, and that's his main topic of conversation. That's what he loves. And he actually told me, and I checked it, and it's true. Do you know Hitler thought vaccine mandates were a bit too far?
Is that right?
Genuinely true. He was like, you got see Jews, 6 million, get rid of. Oh, no, vaccine mandates, no, even I can't do that.
If only we'd known that at the time. This would have been perfect, you know.
Finish with a bit of Godwin's law there.
So even for Hitler, he was like, mate, let's...
There's a nanny state element to this as well, Tom, because only in a very recent episode we were talking about New Zealand's plan to ban smoking, weren't we? And I think I mentioned at the time this was meant to be part of her legacy. I didn't realise she was going to quit quite so quickly. But interesting that, you know, kind Jacinda, the thing that she left as a legacy was what is bound to be an absolute fiasco of ram raiding and smuggling and all the rest of it due to these stupid prohibitionist policies she's introduced. And interesting also, she doesn't really want to be around to see the consequences of it. Reminds me of Tony Blair, who introduced a smoking ban and then left office like about 10 days before the thing came in. Clearly didn't want to be around in case it went wrong.
I think the Iraq War as well might have played a factor in it.
That was what, 4 years earlier? You know, he fought an election after the Iraq War and did all right. The smoking ban was the final thing. That's what I'll never forgive him for.
Let's move on to our final section, which is our postbag section, where listeners can message or email in their questions to Chris and our guests.
All their problems. All their problems. Yeah. Happy to do an agony uncle element.
Exactly. We could definitely work that in. I'm not sure it'd be great advice, but it would be advice. So let's reach into the postbag.
Postbag. It's bulging, eh?
We've got one here from Sean McGinty, very topical. What are your thoughts on the Donald being back on Facebook? Just free speech or a mega meta mess? I see what you've done there, Sean. Francis, how do you feel about Donald he's been given permission to come back. It's not clear whether he will come back, and he's kind of been given a bit of a warning as well that if he steps out of line again, they'll have to kick him off again. But what do you make of this announcement?
Well, look, he should never have been banned in the first place. Let's just be honest about that. So that's number one. Number two, I don't know if he is going to come back. Elon's been trying to persuade him back to come back to Twitter for a long time. Trump says that the only social media platform he will use is Truth Social. So we'll see. But if he wins the nomination, then he has to come back. He has to come back on social media. So I think if he wins and he becomes a Republican candidate, then he has no choice but to go back on all the social media. And I will say this to you, social media, and I'm not the biggest fan of Trump, but it will become a lot more fun as a result.
Well, what do you think, Chris? Are you looking forward to him coming back?
Totally agree. It'd be a lot more fun. I wish he'd start tweeting again. Whether he runs for president or not, he should start tweeting again. His tweets are actually better before he was president than once he was president. He still put out some zingers while he was president, but the real classics, I've never seen a thin person drink Diet Coke and stuff like that, was all way before he ran for president. He must be about the only person on Truth Social, isn't he? I mean, he really needs to drop that idea. None of these parlors and mastodons and all this kind of stuff, none of them have taken off at all, have they?
No, it's always from a very low base, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be realistic. There are network effects that you can't really overcome. I don't care about Facebook because I'm not on Facebook, but please, Donald, if you're listening, come back and start tweeting mad stuff on Twitter.
Do miss it. I want to get that Greta tweet framed, I think. We talked about how she go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend and chill. That was brilliant.
That was a good one. That was while he was president.
That was while he was president. I got one from you specifically here from Matt Hadfield. Mr. Snowdon, very formal. Your politics have always confused me. Would you describe yourself as centre-right? Your essays on the anti-vax idiots have been the only COVID highlight. So you're confusing Matt there. What are you all about?
Only highlight in my writing career for him, is that what you
I
mean?
think he said COVID highlight. So he enjoyed the
COVID highlights. I thought he meant he only likes those articles. There are, to be fair, quite a few people who do only like those articles and then follow me and can get very angry at everything else I say. I am a libertarian, really, or a classical liberal, I suppose. I am a John Stuart Mill liberal, basically. So I don't know where that puts me, left to right. Libertarianism doesn't really fit very easily on the old left-right axis. Prefer to look at politics as a horseshoe top.
We've got another question which I think is interesting. I'll sort of summarize it, but a question here about we're seeing the rise of a kind of soft culture in the West, which embraces what this questioner is saying is a collectivist mindset. What do we think the consequences of that kind of shift towards, whether you want to call it wokeness, whatever you might want to call it, are kind of away from liberalism, it feels like, in many different respects? What are the consequences of that going to be for developing nations? Are they going to embrace this ideology? You got any thoughts on that, Francis? Massive question, but do you think basically is the West going collectivist, as this questioner would put it? Is that a problem for the rest of the world?
Is the West going collectivist? I think a large part of the problem is that a lot of young people look at the economic models or the economic systems that we currently have and feel that they are being excluded from it. And if you are excluded from it, then why should you participate in it? To a certain degree, a classic example of this is the housing crisis. The chances are they're never going to be able to get on the housing ladder. As a result of that, they feel very angry. They feel that actually capitalism isn't working for them. And you could argue, in a way, it isn't working for them as well as it worked for their fathers and for their grandfathers. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But as to the question of poorer countries, are they going to embrace this? No, absolutely not. If you are struggling to make ends meet, or you're struggling to put food on the table, chances are you're not going to give too much. You're not going to care too much about white privilege.
This was a point made in a viral video by your partner, wasn't it, recently?
Yeah.
Constantine.
Yeah.
The developing world is going to save us, hopefully, in so many different ways. This isn't actually a postbag question, but I thought I might ask it, given this is a libertarian podcast, just something to close on. This is a sort of, libertarian, pro-freedom podcast. But I was thinking, if you could have one ban, what would it be? And I want this to be like the pettiest thing you can imagine. So not something that you actually think is probably quite dangerous or whatever, but something you just really loathe, something you find annoying, something you find irritating. Chris, if you could have one sort of petty, illiberal measure, what would you introduce? I
think suitcases on wheels. I find very, very irritating. I think that if people can't really carry their luggage any distance, they should take less luggage.
Oh, I thought you were going to say they shouldn't be able to travel.
or either way. I mean, as long as they get out of my way when I'm in London, that's the main thing. I find I'm often held up. Well, I'm held up by nearly everyone in London because they all walk quite slowly. But particularly by people with big bags on wheels, people who put everything they own into an enormous suitcase on wheels and wheel it around, and then they get to an escalator or some stairs and suddenly find that they are out of their depth and need to stop or need to put the little handle down or up or whatever. And I find it very irritating. I think people should just carry an old-fashioned suitcase. Good to know. Francis, if you had one petty, mean-spirited ban, what would it be?
I'm sure most people know, but my mother is from Venezuela, and we had a terrible president who was an authoritarian and a dictator called Hugo Chavez, who is thankfully died now. Cancer ain't all bad. But he did one good thing in that he banned golf.
Did he?
Yeah, he did. Didn't like it, didn't agree with it, didn't see the purpose of it, saw it as a game of the bourgeoisie and banned it. And you know what? Fair play.
You don't like golf then, Francis?
No, I don't.
Have you ever tried playing it?
No.
It's very hard to play. I like watching golf. Actually, I think watching golf.
Watching golf?
I like watching golf.
That's even weirder, mate.
It's not.
It's a spectator sport. Surely it's quite glacial.
It is if you're there. I've never actually gone to watch it live, and I would never do that because you stood in the same place just watching people hit a ball and you don't even see where it lands. But on TV, it's a masterpiece of editing, live editing, and lovely, lovely scenery when they go to these places in America. Very relaxing. Usually ends up being quite exciting at the end. I like watching the golf, so I can't agree with you there, Francis.
You like watching golf?
Yeah. How many times do I need to say this?
Mate, that is
This is the equivalent of me liking Jacinda Ardern to you, isn't it? We can never be friends.
That is deeply weird. I'm sorry, Chris. We can't be friends.
I'm glad we've ended on a rare note of disagreement, which is always good. But Francis, Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.